Me han encomendado la labor de contextualizar la conferencia virtual de Raewyn Connell, con la cual tuve la oportunidad de desarrollar mi doctorado hace algunos años atrás. Es una tarea un poco difícil porque la persona a la cual yo voy a contextualizar no está acá y todo acto de contextualización es un acto de interpretación. Entonces lo que voy a tratar de hacer es vincular lo que ella va a decir con lo que ha sido la producción teórica y empírica a lo largo de su carrera, de manera de generar elementos para quienes no están familiarizados con su trabajo, que les permita relacionar mejor algunos conceptos que en esta conferencia virtual ella va a tocar. Raewyn es principalmente conocida en esta región, en Latinoamérica, por su contribución a los estudios de género y masculinidades, que su libro Masculinidades, de 1995, reeditado en el 2005, es quizá una obra referencial en este campo, referencial tanto por la influencia que ha tenido como por la crítica que se ha generado sobre ella, libro que fue traducido al español por el Colegio de México el año 2006 o 2003, no me acuerdo. Sin embargo, Raewyn es menos conocida en esta región por otras disciplinas en las cuales ella ha hecho bastante contribución, como el estudio de clases sociales, los estudios educacionales, los estudios sobre sexualidad y educación, los estudios sobre teoría social. Y en la combinación de estas otras disciplinas junto con los estudios de género, que es donde podemos, o pienso yo, que se puede insertar e interpretar lo que Raewyn va a presentar en esta conferencia virtual, donde ella hace un resumen histórico del campo de los estudios de hombre y masculinidad, desde su surgimiento en el campo más bien académico, desde finales de los 70, principios de los 80, enfocándose especialmente en este concepto que ha sido bastante influyente y criticado, como el de la idea de las masculinidades hegemónicas. Esta presentación resume un poco sus perspectivas de trabajo y en este sentido me gustaría vincularlo con 4 ideas que creo que son importantes. Primero, la perspectiva en la preocupación de los estudios de hombre y masculinidades en los procesos sociales históricos que van configurando las relaciones de género y la construcción de masculinidades. Por eso no es casual que a lo largo de esta presentación y en su obra conceptos como proyecto, como trayectorias o como dinámicas sean parte referente del andamiaje conceptual que hace Raewyn. De hecho, un concepto muy poco debatido tanto en el mundo europeo y norteamericano como latinoamericano es esta idea básica de su teoría de género, de la ontoformatividad de las relaciones de género, de la importancia del cuerpo, de la materialidad, pero también de la capacidad no solamente del género de reproducirse, sino de crearse y por lo tanto de cambiar y confrontar estructuras de poder y de dominación. Otro elemento que es central dentro de la teoría de género de Connell y que está presente en la conferencia virtual que vamos a ver es la mirada estructural por sobre la mirada discursiva que existe en su interpretación de las relaciones de género y las masculinidades, es decir, lo que se denomina en el mundo anglosajón una perspectiva materialista que tiene un foco relacional. Y acá me gustaría vincularlo un poco con el trabajo previo de ello. Esta perspectiva relacional, ella la ha trabajado, o como yo interpreto que ella ha trabajado, en 3 distintos momentos, en 3 temas distintos. El primero, en relación a clases sociales, con la publicación de su libro Clase Dirigente, Cultura Dirigente, publicado en 1977, que tiene una saga con la estructura de clase en la historia australiana, donde efectivamente tiene lo que se denomina una perspectiva generativa en la idea de las clases sociales y cómo se vinculan entre ellas a lo largo de la historia como producción en una estructura social general. Un segundo momento que va moviéndose de es desde las teorías de género, donde el género pasa a ser en su andamiaje conceptual un concepto relacional que implica a hombres, a mujeres y las relaciones entre ellos para conformar esta estructura de prácticas y generar esta configuración de prácticas que es lo que ella entiende por género. Y luego un tercer momento, que es más reciente en términos de la publicación, de la notoriedad pública, que en relación a la teoría social y la producción de conocimiento, que está plasmado en uno de sus últimos libros, Teorías del Sur, donde ella hace vuelve a retomar este concepto relacional en términos de la economía política, de la producción de conocimiento, entre estos viejos conceptos para nosotros en Latinoamérica como centro y periferia, o como ella los llama, metrópoli y sur global. Un tercer elemento que también está presente en esta conferencia es la diferencia conceptual, bastante trabajada en el mundo anglosajón y un poco menos acá en el mundo latinoamericano, entre los conceptos de hegemonía y los conceptos de dominación. Y aquí les recomiendo un capítulo de Rodrigo Parrini, donde hace una división, una interpretación entre estos dos conceptos bastante interesante, una de las pocas que yo he visto acá en Latinoamérica. Un cuarto elemento es la influencia, más bien en los últimos 10 años, del pensamiento post-decolonial. Y lo pongo de esta forma porque ella transita entre las ideas postcoloniales, más propias del norte, y las ideas decoloniales, más propias de Latinoamérica. Esto ha generado un cambio en la forma en que ella misma, o como yo interpreto, que ella misma presenta sus teorías sobre el género. Por ejemplo, el libro Género y Poder, publicado en 1987, un año donde se publicaron muchos libros sobre teoría de género en el mundo anglosajón, es un libro que se basa principalmente en autores y en autoras europeas y norteamericanos para dar forma a lo que sería luego su teoría del género, y donde se hacen famosa esta idea de la masculinidad hegemónica, que había aparecido previamente en un libro sobre educación a principios de los 80. Este libro muta en las ediciones siguientes, que es Género del 2002 y Género en Perspectiva Global del 2009 y del 2015 respectivamente, donde ella hace una recuperación de las teorías y de los conceptos, de la mirada de la producción de conocimiento en América del Sur, en África, en Asia y en el sudeste asiático principalmente. De hecho, hay un capítulo en un libro que se acaba de publicar este año que se llama Cuestiones de Género, Nuevas Teorías Social e Investigación, editado por James Messerschmidt y otros, donde María Max Ferré analiza justamente este cambio conceptual en la mirada de género de Connell en un capítulo que se llama Las teorías no crecen en los árboles, y que busca contextualizar los momentos históricos donde Connell realiza estas dos contribuciones al campo de los estudios de género. Esto mismo traído al campo de los estudios de masculinidades, es decir, las masculinidades en perspectiva global, que es la idea de la charla, busca revisar críticamente la revisión entre hegemonía y masculinidad en un contexto de la crítica de y postcolonial. Es decir, preguntarse, ¿este concepto viaja? ¿Es aplicable tal cual en otras regiones? Hay otras formas, por ejemplo, acá desde Latinoamérica se han hecho distintas contribuciones desde las ideas de la masculinidad referente o de los mandatos culturales de la masculinidad, que de cierta forma cambian un poco la perspectiva teórica. Y en este sentido hay un llamado en esta obra más reciente a la necesidad de un entendimiento histórico de la hegemonía en el contexto de la violencia colonial que produce, según ella, un desordenamiento de las relaciones de género en aquellas regiones que fueron colonia, poscolonia y que luego han vivido bajo la globalización neoliberal. Para ir terminando, la masculinidad hegemónica es un concepto que a lo largo de la misma obra de Connell ha cambiado sustantivamente, y esto es una de las principales críticas que se le hacen a ella respecto a este concepto, e incluso recientemente, en dos artículos recientes, ella transita en esta idea de masculinidad hegemónica como dos ideas que son un poco distintas. Primero, retomando la idea gramsciana original, la masculinidad hegemónica como una situación, como un proyecto, como una lucha que está en disputa entre distintos patrones, pero a la vez también a veces se enfoca en determinados grupos de hombres, en hombres poderosos, que ella llama los jugadores principales en las relaciones de poder a nivel global. Sin embargo, a pesar de estas mutaciones, hay elementos que se mantienen, como por ejemplo que la masculinidad hegemónica no es un tipo, que la masculinidad hegemónica no es un caso típico, sino que todo lo contrario, y que tampoco es un conjunto de atributos, sino que es un patrón de prácticas y una idea cultural a la misma vez. Para cerrar, nosotros le pedimos que se enfocara en la masculinidad hegemónica, pero Raewyn no toca otros temas que son permanentes, que me imagino que van a tocar en la primera mesa, en la discusión en la región y en otras partes del mundo, sobre, por ejemplo, la alternativa a la masculinidad hegemónica, la idea de las masculinidades híbridas, por ejemplo, la idea de la vinculación entre masculinidades, emociones y afectividad, por ejemplo, o la crítica de la teoría queer a los mismos estudios de masculinidades, como por ejemplo la desconexión entre sexo y género, es decir, masculinidades fuera de los cuerpos de hombres, o la idea de la posmasculinidad, es decir, una crítica a la masculinidad como reificación de las relaciones tradicionales de género. Sin más, entonces, luego de esta contextualización interpretativa, los dejo con la conferencia de Raewyn Connell, Masculinidad Hegemónica y las contribuciones al género desde el sur. Muchas gracias.
Well, greetings from Australia, from the other side of the Pacific. Hope things are going well. I have very good memories of the original conference 20 years ago, back in 1998, and I got a great deal out of that conference, and as other people did, and I hope this one goes as well. So I'm sorry I can't be with you in the flesh, but with the miracle of electronic communication, we'll do our best, and I hope that you have 2 good days from now on. I became involved in research on men, masculinities and boys basically as a result of the impact of the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement in the Anglophone world. Movements that challenged existing understandings of power and oppression by pointing to the need to understand those issues in new ways. Now, of course, this wasn't the first time there'd been talk about gender issues, indeed about men and about masculinities. But there was a fairly widespread conventional view at the time that what it was to be a man was sort of laid down, was fixed either by God or by nature. And similarly, what it was to be a woman was, as the Germans put it, to be concerned with Kinder, Kirche und Küche, children, the church and the kitchen. And those were just fixed in human nature, one way or the other. But by then there was a more radical view, which was expressed in those social movements, that masculinity and femininity were socially defined, were learned, in fact, and could be understood in terms of role theory. So there was a language of male and female sex roles, which were defined in a given society by norms, by doctrines of what masculinity and femininity ought to be, how people ought to behave, and sanctions applied to people who failed to conform to the male role or the female role. Now, that was a view popularised in the social movements of the 1970s, but also challenged because those movements also showed the inadequacy of role thinking. Because it became very clear, for instance, out of gay liberation movement, that there was not just one version of the male role, but there were multiple ways of being a man, and relationships between them. There were livable ways of being a gay man. And similarly, feminism, as it diversified or recognised the diversity that was always there, also began to recognise different ways different forms of the male role, different norms about masculinity, different classes, for instance. But both of those movements, all the social movements of that time, in fact, also highlighted the issue of power. And that was a fundamental issue that role theory could not theorize well. So the question of how power relations and the capacity for oppression were actually sustained over time remained as an unsolved problem at that time. And that was where Gramsci's notion of hegemony was recognized as useful. And it became possible to think of masculinity, or at least particular forms of masculinity, as having a hegemonic role in the reproduction of a patriarchal gender order. And that was basically where the concept of hegemonic masculinity came from. So that was the framework, if you like, in which the early research on men and masculinities was launched in the context of a shift towards social definitions, but a bit of a struggle over what kind of social theory would be adequate. In the 1990s, the research which had been launched on men and masculinities actually emerged as a reasonably coherent field of research and conceptual debate, and was obviously under construction globally, not just in particular milieu. And I want to show you this with some of the significant publications of the time. In Germany, for instance, which had been one of the pioneers in the 1980s of feminist research on men and masculinities, we had books like this collection of critical studies on masculinities. In Peru, of course, as you will know, the work of Norma Fuller, I understand is going to be with you. In South Africa, at much the same time, in 1997, there was an important pioneering conference, the first conference on studies of masculinities in Africa, which produced a few years later this book, and you can see how the cover captures the idea of diversity in masculinities. In Brazil, work by Margareta Ria, who was at that 1998 conference, and her colleagues began putting together a range of studies of the situations of men, boys, and masculinities. In Japan, pioneering social research by colleagues like Taga Futoshi, who produced this monograph on the construction of masculinity among middle-class men at much the same time. And of course, at the same time, there was work going on in Australia, in Chile, and we saw basically a global discourse about men and masculinities being emerging. And with it, some of the academic practicalities of new fields of study. So we had journals being founded, we had university courses taught, we had research projects being funded, and we had conferences being convened, and international exchange of ideas and research results became possible. We could say then that this is the moment when a global field of research and discussion consolidates. Now, we should also remember the practicality, not just the academic practicalities, but the wider circumstances in which that was happening. So, at the beginning of the 1990s, we saw the end of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War dictatorships in Russia, in a number of countries in Latin America, in South Africa, the apartheid regime was coming to an end. In East and Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, for instance, the Cold War dictatorship of the New Order there was coming to an end. And in those circumstances, it was easy to think, and I think we did think at that time, that there were real possibilities for a new gender order, a more democratic gender order on a global scale. That a new politics of gender relations was emerging, was not just possible, but it's actually with us. And as part of that, part of the discourse that was coming out of the research and conceptual debate was the idea of new forms of masculinity, new ways of being a man that were now in view, that were practically possible. But at the same time, we also have to recognise that that was the moment of the Washington consensus, of the rapid global spread of the neoliberal model of economics and politics, which had been pioneered in Chile, in other parts of Latin America, and then in Britain and the United States. So a civil neoliberalism was replacing authoritarian neoliberalism, and that took with it, that had with it a gender project of shifting resources from public sectors, the interests of women, to private sectors where the economic interests of men were more represented. Okay, I now want to say something about what's happened in the field in the 20 years since our previous conference. Basically, the field that had been formed, the global field of research and discussion that had been formed in the 1980s, from the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, it matured as a research field. The volume of research has increased quite significantly. Research and the uptake, the recognition of research. So as a small example of that, if you look up my book Masculinities in Google Scholar or some citation index like that, you'll find that book has rather more than 20,000 citations, which is an indication that the work, because that book is bringing together a range of studies in the field, the work is now getting around quite widely. And I think we can reasonably say that it's not just that book, but there is a global circulation of the concepts that have been developing in the field of research on men and masculinities, and the models of understanding, the modes of understanding men's and boys' lives that this research now underpins. So let me indicate a few more of the texts that have emerged. This is from India, the work of Radhika Chopra, a field researcher, ethnographer, who in this text brings together a range of Indian studies on different aspects of the lives of men and boys. Some very interesting work on education, for instance, in this book. In Southeast Asia, there's also an increasing volume of research with its incredible cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, and difficult politics of development. China, too, becomes a site of not just the importation of Western concepts, as the Chinese would usually put it, but of their own debates and discourse. This is the work of Fang Gang, one of the leaders of Chinese work in this field. So we're getting a genuinely global circulation. There's no region of the world now in which this kind of research and debate is lacking. But as the field matures and the scope of research and debate increases, there is, of course, more intellectual diversity in it. That's not just as a result of cultural differences in different regions. There are genuine intellectual divergencies going on. A lot of the work influenced by European post-structuralist ideas focuses on the constructions of identities, sees masculinity basically as a form of identity, and thinks of gender as a domain of discourse. On the other hand, there's a social realist approach, more connected with sociology, more prevalent, I think, in Latin America, in Australia, in Africa, than in North America, which is concerned with the material circumstances, with the institutionalization of masculinities, and with the connections of masculinity and changes and tensions in masculinity with economic change. But regardless of these divergent ideas in the field, one of the really striking features of the mature field of debate here is the significance of applied knowledge. So information, ideas about masculinities don't just remain among the researchers. They circulate, and they have been circulating, in fact, throughout the history of the field, in fields of applied work. For instance, in education, in work on the education of boys, in health sciences, in work on men's health, which we produced a report on in Australia just 20 years ago, and which is one of the more significant applied fields. In counselling, psychotherapy, in criminology, given the predominance of men in law breaking, especially violent forms of crime, and of course in the prevention of gender-based violence, domestic violence, rape, and the like. In all of these areas, the field of research has been feeding ideas, conceptions and information into applied work and making that more focused and more realistic. Now, this wouldn't have been possible, I guess, without a recognition that a different kind of gender politics was possible, as I was saying a few minutes ago. So we also see at this time the emergence on a world scale of a progressive masculinity politics. A striking moment in that comes in 2004 at the United Nations, when the Commission on the Status of Women devotes a significant part of its meeting to discussing the role of men and boys in achieving gender equality, which then becomes the subject of publications out of United Nations agencies, which you can find online. And part of that was the writing of what remains, I think, the first and still probably the only general policy statement on men, masculinities and gender equality on a world scale. But there is, however, a world scale of activism beyond the United Nations. So we now have a very wide range of non-government organisations which are involved in progressive work with men and boys in Latin America, as you know, in India, around Southeast Asia, and even in East Asia. And these, again, as I'm sure most people at the conference know, are linked globally through the Men Engaged network, which now has something like 600 member organisations in different parts of the world. So that's at any rate, my summary view, the state of the field as we see it now. But this is also the moment when we need to be thinking of fairly basic intellectual change, which has become possible as a result of developments outside this particular field, and which we now have to think through within it. This is the emergence of Southern perspectives in the social sciences. And I'll have to go back a couple of steps in discussing this to point out that in just about all areas of research, whether they're social science, humanities, physical sciences, mathematical sciences, we work in a global economy of knowledge with contributions from all over the world. This is a system for the production of knowledge and the exchange of knowledge, which has existed for hundreds of years, but not in a homogeneous way. The global economy of knowledge has always been strongly structured in a form which dates back to the era of the old overseas European empires, in which the colonised world, what we now call the global south, has functioned as a huge data mine. So the colonies didn't just produce silver, cotton, sugar and slaves, they also produced data for the growth of knowledge. And the global north, the metropolitan centre, becomes the centre for the accumulation of knowledge, the theorising of knowledge, the turning of data into organised concepts, and the turning of theoretical science into applied sciences, which are then returned to the global periphery in the form of professional knowledge. That's a pattern which was created in the era of European empires, but which has persisted very strongly in the organisation of knowledge since formal decolonisation processes, which began a couple of hundred years ago. So it's still the case, and this applies even to new fields of gender studies. This applies even to new fields of knowledge like gender studies. So around the periphery of the world, we naturally, it's almost taken for granted, common sense way of proceeding, we read Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, Joan Scott, and the other theorists of the global north. We don't expect them to read us, and mostly they don't. It's not required in their practice as knowledge workers. So the global economy of knowledge thus has a global division of labour. Theory, basically the enterprise of the global north, data production, basically the enterprise of the global south. And yet we know the global south does make theory, and has been making theory ever since colonisation began. So there has been conceptualisation, debate, theoretical argument going on about the process of colonisation itself, coming from colonised societies too. And that is the basis from which has grown post-colonial theory, decolonising agendas, decolonial thought, what I call Southern theory, the critique of the global economy of knowledge in its mainstream form. So in the light of Southern theory and post-colonial and decolonial thought, most of this work so far has been programmatic, I guess, pointing to intellectual work that has been done in the global south and suggesting new frameworks, new epistemological frameworks. But there hasn't been all that much substantive novelty, I think, in the perspectives. And this is where work on men and masculinities, I think, might be very significant in this whole debate. Because in this field, in our field, there are, in fact, a couple of really key points that have already emerged, which point to new ways of thinking about basic concepts in the field. The first is illustrated by the work of Robert Morrell in South Africa, who I think I've already mentioned his edited book. But this is his own monograph on the history of settler colonial masculinity in Natal, in southeastern Africa. In this work, this beautiful piece of historical research, he traced the creation of a hegemonic form of masculinity among the colonizers and showed that this was basically producing a pattern of masculinity that worked for the process of conquest and the consolidation of conquest. That is, for the exertion of force, for the rule over the colonized through the application of military force and then of police powers. In other words, what that is indicating is that a masculinity that was hegemonic among the colonizers did not at the same time represent a hegemonic masculinity, a hegemonic situation in regard to the colonized, to the indigenous population who were in that context and still are in South Africa the majority. So hegemony thus was called into question by this kind of research. And I've recently begun to connect that with debates around subaltern studies, particularly the work of Ranajit Guha, the founding editor of that journal, Subaltern Studies, who published an important essay called Dominance Without Hegemony, Domination Without Hegemony, in which he argued that the British rule in India, although it claimed hegemony, in fact did not have it. That the colonial rule of the British in India was essentially a product of colonising violence and sustained application of physical force, of military force, rather than the achievement of hegemony. And that has made me think that what we have tended to assume about hegemonic masculinity, that it was the reproduction, that it was a means of reproduction of patriarchal gender relations over time. Hegemonic masculinity in that sense might be a special case rather than the typical case in gender relations worldwide. Now, I want to connect that with a second point, which also emerges when we begin to connect Southern theory with gender studies. And this is a point that comes out of a range of work in global South feminism, going back to the work of Helena Safiotti in Brazil. And the point is a simple one, but a profound one, that the historical construction of the modern gender order in colonial and post-colonial societies is a different historical process from the construction of the modern gender order in Europe and North America, precisely because it has the discontinuity of colonization and the social discontinuities that follow from colonization and colonial power as a central feature of the construction of gender orders. And this is represented in research on masculinities, for instance, by the research of Mara Viveros, who I understand is also with you at the conference, showing the profound racialization of gender relations in post-colonial contexts in Latin America. And the same is true, of course, in other parts of the world, and comes out in that international research from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and very conspicuously in Africa. So here I would connect what's happening has emerged in our field with the arguments of Aníbal Quijano about the coloniality of power, the persistence in the post-colonial period of structures of power and authority, institutionalized structures, which have continuity with the power structures of the colonial era itself. And I want to connect that, or apply that concept, within the field of gender dynamics itself. So what this does, basically, is lead to a revised view of hegemonic masculinity, not as a means of social reproduction, of the simple reproduction of a consolidated patriarchal gender order, but rather seeing hegemonic masculinity always as a project of attempting to achieve hegemony in a social context where hegemony may in fact be lacking. More than that, I'd argue that hegemonic masculinity, understood in this way, is always a collective project of the powerful, interwoven with class and race relationships, and always imperfect. We must recognise that the achievement of hegemony is always under stress, always partial, always open to contestation, and indeed always containing internal tensions which may bring certain patterns of masculinity to a crisis or to an end. And that's the approach I want to bring into contemporary analysis, looking at forms of masculinity and the politics of masculinity in the world today. So when we look at the very conspicuous examples of politicized masculinity around the world, Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, Modi, are we looking at hegemonic masculinity? We're certainly looking at patriarchal masculinities here, but hegemonic? I doubt it. I think what we're looking at in these cases rather is a kind of restoration project, a masculinity interwoven with a project of establishing new authoritarian forms of rule, but one that lacks established cultural hegemony and therefore must mobilise racism, religion, fear of alternative forms of gender, all of these features that really characterise the new authoritarian populism and create puzzles for understanding them if we don't recognise the fragility, in fact, that underlies them. This indeed is fragility. I think underlies the intensity of lying and distortion that accompanies the new authoritarianism, the fake news that is constantly pouring out of these mobilisations, to me is a measure of their cultural weakness, not their strength. And it is very much an arena in which contestation is possible. Now, there are, of course, specific gender campaigns, the anti-gender campaign with Catholic activism involved in countries like France and Colombia, homophobic mobilisations, very conspicuous in East Africa, femicide, the killing of visible women in Iraq, anti-feminist actions such as the arrests of feminist activists recently in China. These two, I think, all signify attempts at repressing progressive mobilisations and signify the fragile legitimacy of the restoration projects. So, despite the apparent upsurge of authoritarianism, the struggle continues, as the Italians say, lotta continua. And new forms of struggle are needed in this world, where in some ways the neoliberal consensus has been lost. These authoritarianisms are not classic neoliberalism, though they may in some ways be more dangerous to, for instance, in nuclear politics. And as long as the struggle continues, we need the kind of research that has been being done around men and masculinities and will continue to be done. We need to document the contemporary realities of men's lives and patterns of masculinity. We do need to understand them in new ways, as I've been arguing. Latin America has been seeing some of the most creative research in this field anywhere in the world. You can take that, I think, as established fact. about gender relations generally, about men and masculinities specifically. And I'm sure that will continue into the future. So I wish you all the best for the conference and for the research that will be continuing from it. Best wishes for your work now.